The Galactic Council had given up on deciphering the Vathian language centuries ago. The ancient alien civilization had vanished 10,000 years prior, leaving behind monuments, artifacts, and countless inscriptions that remained stubbornly incomprehensible. Linguistic experts from a dozen species had attempted the task over generations, each one ultimately conceding defeat. Some of the brightest minds in the known universe had spent their entire lives trying to crack the code, only to fail. Dr. Teo was a lanky human linguist with an unusual obsession for dead languages. He had spent most of his life studying languages that nobody spoke anymore, languages that existed only in old texts and ancient stones. His colleague was Dr. HFY, a sharp-minded woman whose background spanned both computational biology and language theory. Together, they made an unusual team, but they worked well with each other. They had arrived on the orbital station just days ago, and already the older council members were dismissive of their credentials. The orbital station hung in space above a dead world where the Vathian civilization had once thrived. The planet below was barren now, covered in ruins and ancient buildings that had stood for millennia without repair. The station itself was a marvel of engineering, with corridors that stretched for kilometers and storage chambers that held countless artifacts. The walls were lined with data screens showing information in 1,000 different languages, but none of them showed the meaning of the Vathian texts. Teo and HFY had been assigned a private chamber to work in. The room was large and empty, with only a few tables and a holographic display system. The display could show any of the Vathian artifacts they wanted to study. They could zoom in on individual symbols or expand their view to see entire inscriptions. It was an impressive setup, but neither of them felt confident about their chances of success. "Humans have been sapient for mere millennia," the Zelthian ambassador had sneered during their introduction to the council. "Yet you believe you can solve what our most brilliant minds could not?" The Zelthians were a tall, graceful species with skin that shimmered like silver. They had been around for longer than most civilizations could remember. To them, humans were barely more than children. Teo had simply smiled at the ambassador's words. "We have something you do not," he replied calmly. "We have Duo-Lingo." The ambassador had looked confused by this statement, and several of the other council members had exchanged puzzled glances. Duo-Lingo was a language learning application that humans had developed centuries ago. It was designed to teach people new languages quickly and efficiently. The application used artificial intelligence to understand how each person learned best and adjusted its teaching methods accordingly. It had become so popular that billions of humans used it every day to learn languages from different parts of Earth and from other worlds. Most council members probably considered it a trivial tool, something for school children and tourists, not for serious linguistic work. HFY had rolled her eyes when Teo mentioned Duo-Lingo to the council. She understood what her partner meant, but she also knew how his comment would sound to the others. Now, standing together in their chamber and staring at the holographic database of Vathian texts, she finally understood the full scope of his vision. The database contained hundreds of thousands of inscriptions. Some were carved into stone, some were painted on metal plates, others were etched into crystal or written on materials that no longer existed on Earth. Each inscription was different, yet each one was also part of a larger pattern. Somewhere within all these texts, hidden among millions of symbols, was the key to understanding an entire language. "Where do we even start?" HFY asked, running her fingers through her hair. The task seemed impossible. They had 90 days, 3 months to achieve what centuries had failed to accomplish. 3 months to do what the greatest minds in the galaxy had given up on. Teo walked over to the holographic display and began scrolling through the texts. He was looking for patterns, for anything that might repeat. In his experience with human languages, certain words appeared more frequently than others. Words for basic things like water, food, sun, and night appeared in almost every text. If he could find the Vathian words for these simple concepts, he could build a foundation to work from. "We start small," he said to HFY. "We look for the most common symbols. We find the words that appear in every text. Then we use those words to understand the context of other words around them." HFY nodded slowly. It was a logical approach, but it was also one that had been tried before. Previous linguists had done exactly this analysis and had gotten nowhere. The Vathian language did not seem to work the way other languages worked. The most common symbols did not appear to be simple words. They appeared to be complex grammatical markers or structural elements that had no clear meaning on their own. "But we have something those researchers did not," Teo continued. He pulled out a small device from his pocket. It was a portable interface for Duo-Lingo, designed to work with the holographic systems on the station. "We have a machine that learned how to teach humans by watching billions of humans learn. It has been trained on every teaching method that works, every way that a human brain can understand something new." He began connecting his device to the holographic system. Data flowed across the displays, creating patterns and structures that had not been visible before. The AI began analyzing the inscriptions, not looking for meaning, but looking for patterns in how the patterns were arranged. "The old researchers approached this problem like engineers," Teo explained. "They looked at the language as a puzzle to be solved through logic and systematic analysis. But Duo-Lingo approaches it like a teacher approaches a student. It looks for the easiest path to understanding. It finds the patterns that the human brain can most easily recognize. And maybe, just maybe, the Vathians designed their language in a way that works with how any intelligent mind naturally learns." HFY watched as the holographic display transformed. Symbols began to glow in different colors based on their frequency and context. Patterns that had seemed random before now appeared to have structure. It was beautiful in a strange way, seeing language visualized like music, each symbol a note in a symphony that had been silent for 10,000 years. "Let's do this," HFY said, moving to her own workstation. She began pulling up data about the Vathian culture, their architecture, their art. If she could understand how the Vathians lived and thought, perhaps she could understand how their language worked. The clock on the wall showed that they had exactly 89 days remaining. In the corner of the holographic display, Teo had set up a countdown timer, a simple reminder of the deadline they were racing against. Neither of them said it aloud, but both of them knew the same thing. If they could not make significant progress within the first few weeks, they would never make progress at all. The council was skeptical now, and skepticism could easily turn to dismissal. Outside the chamber's single window, the ruined planet turned slowly below them. The cities and monuments of a great civilization lay silent on the surface, keeping their secrets. But somewhere in those secrets was the key to understanding humanity's place in the galaxy and the reason why the ancient Vathians had left their language behind for someone to find. The first breakthrough came on day 12, just as Teo and HFY were beginning to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. They had not slept much during those 12 days. Both of them had been working almost around the clock, taking short breaks only when their bodies absolutely demanded rest. The work was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. Every hour brought new discoveries, new patterns that the Duo-Lingo system could analyze and categorize. HFY had been doing something that the previous researchers probably had never done. She was not looking at the Vathian language as a puzzle to be solved through pure logic. Instead, she was looking at it as a story. She had begun sorting through the particle scans of ancient Vathian documents, looking for any repeated symbols or patterns. Most researchers would have used computers to do this work, but HFY believed that human intuition could sometimes see things that machines missed. She sat with the data for hours, letting her eyes move across the symbols, letting her mind make connections that conscious thought could not make. One morning, as the sun rose over the dead planet below, HFY suddenly saw something that made her sit up straight in her chair. She called Teo over immediately. He was working on the other side of the chamber, training the Duo-Lingo system to recognize certain grammatical patterns. He hurried over, carrying a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. "Look at this," HFY said, pulling up a hologram of a ceremonial tablet. The tablet was beautiful, carved from stone that glowed faintly with residual energy from some ancient process. She traced her finger along a series of symbols, pointing at a sequence that appeared at the beginning of the inscription. This sequence appears in 17 different texts. I have checked them all manually. It appears at the beginning of major inscriptions, in the middle of smaller texts, and even at the end of some documents. But here is what is interesting. She expanded the hologram, showing the symbols that came before and after the repeated sequence. The symbols surrounding this sequence change completely. If this were a prefix or suffix, something that only appeared at the beginning or end of words, then the surrounding symbols would be consistent. But they are not. They change every time. Teo leaned closer, studying the pattern. His eyes moved back and forth, analyzing what HFY had discovered. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he was already beginning to understand. If this were a simple grammatical marker, it would not vary so much. But if it is a core concept, a fundamental idea like life or knowledge or consciousness, then the surrounding words are describing it, explaining it, using it in different ways. The same core idea appears in many different contexts, surrounded by different modifying words. Teo's eyes widened. He began to feel the first real surge of hope since they had arrived at the station. This was exactly the kind of breakthrough they needed. He quickly fed the data into Duolingo's pattern recognition module. He typed in the information about the repeated sequence, marked all 17 instances in the database, and let the artificial intelligence begin its analysis. The system worked quickly, far faster than any human researcher could work. Within minutes, Duolingo had cross-referenced the repeated sequence with hundreds of other inscriptions. The AI was looking for places where this sequence appeared, examining the context in which it was used, analyzing the probability that this sequence represented a single, consistent meaning across all the different texts. "It is finding matches," Teo whispered, watching the screen. The number of instances kept climbing. 20, 30, 50. Over 200 matches in the database, all using this same core sequence in different contexts. "It is working," Teo breathed aloud, his voice filled with wonder. "It is actually working." HFY felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. They had been taking shots in the dark, working on faith and intuition, hoping that their unconventional approach would somehow succeed where centuries of conventional research had failed. But now, they had proof. They had something real. They had a starting point. Over the next 13 days, the work accelerated. Now that they had found one core concept, they could begin to find others. The Duo-Lingo system learned to recognize patterns that Teo and HFY pointed out. The more patterns they identified, the more the system could learn. Each new discovery fed into the algorithm, making it better and faster at finding additional patterns. By day 25, they had identified 40 verified word meanings. It was not a large vocabulary, but it was a beginning. They had words for basic concepts like life, death, knowledge, light, darkness, water, and stone. They had identified several words that seemed to be action words, what most languages would call verbs. They had found evidence of grammatical markers that indicated tense and number. By day 38, they had reconstructed an entire grammatical framework for the Vathian language. They could see how the language was structured, how it functioned, how meaning was created through the combination of symbols. The Vathian language they discovered was far more logical and systematic than any human language on Earth. It was almost elegant in its design. "This is incredible," HFY said on day 38, looking at the complete grammatical structure they had created. The Vathians organized their language perfectly. There are no irregular verbs, no exceptions to the rules. Everything follows a clear pattern. Teo nodded, but he was thinking about something else. "Too perfect," he said slowly. "Natural languages never develop like this. Languages grow over thousands of years, with countless people speaking them, changing them, making mistakes that become accepted. But this language, it is as if someone designed it intentionally. As if someone made sure that every aspect of the language was simple and logical and easy to understand." HFY's eyes widened as she realized what Teo was suggesting. "You think the Vathians created this language deliberately? You think they designed it to be easy to learn?" "I think they designed it for someone," Teo replied. "Someone they knew would come looking for them. Someone they wanted to be able to understand their words, thousands or tens of thousands of years in the future." The implications of this realization began to sink in. If the Vathians had deliberately designed their language to be learnable, then every aspect of the structure, every choice they had made, had a purpose. They were not studying a language that had evolved naturally. They were studying a message that had been carefully constructed to be understood. This knowledge changed everything about how they approached the remaining work. They were not trying to decode an ancient mystery. They were trying to read a letter that had been written for them, and perhaps for every intelligent species that might come looking for the Vathians. The pressure they felt was enormous, but so was the sense that they were on the verge of something truly extraordinary. On day 43, HFY made a discovery that stopped both of them cold. She had been examining a collection of texts that had been found in what archaeologists called a meditation chamber. The chamber was located deep underground in one of the largest Vathian ruins on the planet below. The texts there were different from the others. They were not carved into stone or written on metal. Instead, they had been painted carefully on the walls in a substance that had somehow remained preserved for 10,000 years. HFY had been studying these paintings for days, using the Duo-Lingo system to translate sections of them. Most of what she had translated seemed meaningless, repetitive, almost boring. Words and phrases repeated over and over, arranged in patterns that seemed designed to show every possible grammatical variation. For a long time, she had paid little attention to this chamber's texts. They seemed like practice exercises rather than important documents. But then she began to understand what she was actually reading. She pulled up the full translations on her workstation, displaying them all on a massive holographic screen. Teo came over to see what she had discovered, and she pointed at the walls of text, her hands trembling slightly. "These are not random texts," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "Teo, these are instructions. They are teaching language. They are teaching us." The realization hit like a supernova. Teo sat down heavily in the nearest chair, struggling to process what HFY was saying. The ancient Vathians had not simply left monuments behind for future civilizations to admire. They had not just stored their knowledge and hoped that someone would figure out how to read it. The Vathians had left behind a complete, systematic, and extremely well-designed course in their own language. Every text, every inscription, had been carefully structured with the knowledge of how any intelligent species might naturally learn to understand language. The meditation chamber was essentially a classroom, left behind 10,000 years ago for anyone who might find it. The Vathians had anticipated their own extinction, or at least the possibility that their civilization might end, and they had taken measures to ensure that their knowledge would not be lost forever. "Look at this structure," HFY said, pointing at the patterns of text on the wall. The simplest words appear first. The most basic grammar is shown in the earliest inscriptions. Then, gradually, the complexity increases. Each wall of the chamber presents something new, something that builds on what came before. This is not a library. This is a school. The two researchers began to understand the full scope of what the Vathians had done. They had designed their entire language as if it were meant to be taught, meant to be learned by anyone, regardless of their species or their natural way of thinking. The language was a bridge between minds, constructed deliberately to be as accessible as possible. Tayo thought about what he had said before, about Duo-Lingo. He had mentioned that the language learning application was designed to teach humans by understanding how human brains naturally learn. But Duo-Lingo worked on human minds, using techniques that humans had discovered about how humans specifically learned. The Vathian language, on the other hand, appeared to have been designed to work with any intelligent mind, regardless of its species or its natural way of processing information. "This changes everything," Tayo said quietly. Duo-Lingo was successful not because it is a great artificial intelligence. It was successful because the Vathians had already figured out the fundamental principles of how intelligence itself learns and processes information. The Vathians designed their language to match those principles. Duo-Lingo, built on human understanding of learning, just happens to match the same principles. With this realization, progress accelerated exponentially. Tayo and HFY no longer had to guess about how the language worked or what the texts meant. The Vathians had provided a complete educational framework. By day 52, both of them could read basic Vathian texts with confidence. By day 60, they were translating complex philosophical treatises and understanding the nuances of Vathian thought. The repository of knowledge began to open like a flower blooming in fast motion. Ancient poetry emerged from the texts, showing the Vathians' love of beauty and artistic expression. Architectural blueprints revealed how they had constructed their great cities and monuments. Scientific formulas showed their understanding of physics and chemistry. Knowledge that was in many ways more advanced than what the Galactic Council currently possessed. Historical records told the story of the Vathian civilization, how it had risen and grown for millions of years, how it had spread across countless worlds, how it had achieved things that most races could only dream of. The Vathians had not been mythological gods or all-powerful beings. They had been like any other species, but they had been patient and wise and willing to learn from their mistakes. Then came day 67. That morning, HFY was exploring a section of the archive that had not yet been fully cataloged. The archive was a massive chamber, larger than many human buildings, filled with artifacts and texts from the Vathian civilization. Most of the major discoveries had been made in the more obvious locations, the places where researchers would naturally look first. But HFY had a habit of exploring thoroughly, of checking every corner and crevice. She discovered a hidden chamber behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall. The passage leading into it was so narrow that she had to squeeze through carefully. Inside, the chamber was small and perfectly circular, with walls that glowed with the same faint bioluminescence as the meditation chamber texts. At the center of the chamber, carved into the stone floor, was a single inscription. The symbols glowed more brightly than any other Vathian text they had seen. HFY immediately called for Tayo, and together they approached the inscription with reverence, understanding that this was something important, something that the Vathians had wanted to hide away until the right time, until someone worthy had discovered their language. HFY began to read, her Vathian vocabulary now strong enough that she could translate complex sentences without needing to consult the Duo-Lingo system. Her voice was steady and clear as she spoke the ancient words aloud, translating them into simple human language as she went. To whoever finds these words, she read, we are the Vethians. We have built empires across galaxies and unlocked the secrets of existence itself. Yet we have discovered that knowledge without wisdom leads only to destruction. We have chosen to disperse our civilization, to scatter our consciousness across the universe so that we might learn what it means to grow and to understand. This language is our gift and our test. If you can learn to understand us, you are ready to understand yourselves. We leave behind a repository of knowledge and power for those who follow. But this repository is sealed, protected by puzzles that can only be solved by those who have first learned our language, first proven their patience and intelligence and willingness to grow. The inscription continued, describing coordinates to a vast repository hidden somewhere in the galaxy, filled with technologies and knowledge that could change the course of any civilization. It was sealed behind a puzzle that could only be solved by a species patient and clever enough to decode the Vethian language and understand their message. By day 75, the full scope of Duo-Lingo's success was impossible to ignore. News of Tayo and Haiwan's discoveries had spread throughout the orbital station and then outward to the rest of the Galactic Council. The Council held an emergency session to assess the implications of what had been achieved. Representatives from every major species gathered in the Great Council Chamber, a massive hall that could hold delegates from 100 different civilizations simultaneously. The Zelthian ambassador, who had been so dismissive of the two humans weeks earlier, now stood before the Council with an expression of barely contained shock. She had reviewed all the data personally and had verified the translations. There was no doubt. Two humans and an artificial intelligence application designed for schoolchildren had accomplished something that the greatest minds in the galaxy had given up on. They have completed 90% of the Vethian corpus in 9 weeks, the ambassador said, her voice carrying weight that had not been there before. What was thought impossible even for the greatest minds of our alliance has been achieved by 2 humans and a language learning application. The implications of this success are significant. The council chamber erupted in questions and debate. Representatives demanded to know the secret. How had it been done? What method had been used? Were the translations accurate? Could they be trusted? Could the coordinates to the repository be verified? Tayo and Haiwan were invited to present their findings before the full council. They entered the great chamber together, walking across the polished floor toward the central podium. The chamber was intimidating, with thousands of eyes watching them from gallery seats that rose up in circles around the central floor. Representatives of species with 4 eyes watched beside representatives with only 2. Beings of pure energy hovered near creatures of solid matter. The diversity of the council was staggering, yet every single one of them was watching the 2 humans with intense interest. Tayo stood at the podium first. His voice was calm and clear as he began to speak. He explained the basic strategy that had led to their success, walking the council through the early days when they had searched for patterns, found the repeated symbols, and fed the data into Duo-Lingo. The Vethians did not make their language difficult to learn, Tayo said carefully. Instead, they made it optimally designed to be learned by any intelligent species. They understood linguistic patterns at a level that we are only beginning to grasp. The language itself is a masterpiece of pedagogical engineering. Every aspect of its structure has been created to make it accessible to minds that work in different ways. He gestured to Haiwan. But more importantly, humanity has something that I do not believe any other species in this council takes full advantage of. We are comfortable with uncertainty. We learn through play, through games, through trial and error. Most of your civilizations approach linguistic decryption as a technical problem requiring decades of systematic analysis. We approached it like a puzzle we had never seen before, the kind of puzzle that human children learn to solve by age 5. The council members shifted in their seats, processing this statement. What Teo was saying was that human strength did not come from greater intelligence or superior technology. It came from a fundamentally different approach to problem solving, one born from a species that had survived by adaptability and quick learning. HFY stepped forward, ready to add her own explanation. The Vathian language was designed to be learned like a game, she said. The texts in the meditation chamber teach language through repetition and example, the same way that Duo-Lingo teaches humans new languages. The Duo-Lingo system was designed by studying how humans naturally learn. It uses principles of immediate feedback, adaptive difficulty, and rewarding progress. We did not bring these principles to the Vathian language. The Vathians had already used these principles 10,000 years ago when they created their language in the first place. She paused, letting her words sink in. What we did was recognize that an application designed for human learners happened to match the teaching methodology that the Vathians had built into their own language. When we applied the tool to the texts, we were not forcing a square peg into a round hole. We were simply allowing the Vathian design to speak to what humans naturally understand about learning itself. A representative from the Calthian species, beings known for their patience and methodical approach to research, raised a question. But surely the application's artificial intelligence contributed significantly to the breakthrough. The machine learning capabilities must have been essential to solving the problem. Teo nodded respectfully. The machine learning was important, but I would argue that it was less important than the human intuition that guided it. My colleague HFY noticed patterns that the machine alone would have taken months to discover. She looked at the texts with the eyes of a storyteller, not the eyes of a computer. She asked why about things that did not make sense, and those questions led us in the right direction. The machine was a tool, but the human mind wielding the tool was what truly mattered. A Zelthian spoke up. This was not the ambassador, but a younger council member who had studied human culture. Are you suggesting that the 3-month timeline you were given was actually achievable because the Vathians had anticipated humanity's approach to learning? Perhaps not humanity specifically, HFY replied carefully, but intelligence in general. The Vathians seemed to understand something fundamental about how any thinking being naturally learns. They designed their language and their teaching texts with that understanding in mind. Humanity simply represents one manifestation of that kind of learning, one that happened to align perfectly with what the Vathians had created. The council was silent for a long moment. The implications of what had been accomplished were sinking in. For thousands of years, the various civilizations of the galaxy had competed and cooperated, each believing their own approach to knowledge and problem-solving was the most effective. But now it was clear that a young species, one that had only recently joined the council, had accomplished something that older and supposedly more advanced civilizations could not. The Zelthian ambassador stood again. 2 humans have completed what our finest scholars could not, she said, her voice formal and measured. This raises questions about the nature of intelligence itself, about the different ways that different minds approach problems, about the value of approaches that seem less rigorous but may actually be more creative. The council would be foolish not to learn from this experience. Over the next few days, the council began to digest the full scope of the translations that Teo and HFY had completed. Scientists verified the Vathian formulas and found that they were accurate, representing knowledge that was in many ways superior to what the council currently possessed. Historians read the Vathian records and gained new understanding of the ancient civilization. Engineers studied the Vathian blueprints and began to understand the principles behind structures that had puzzled them for centuries, and preparations began for an expedition to find the repository. Using the coordinates from the hidden chamber, the council prepared to seek out the great store of Vathian knowledge that had been sealed away for 10,000 years. The expedition would be the most important journey that any of them had ever undertaken, and it had all begun with 2 humans and a language-learning application that no one had thought would matter. On day 89, Teo and Hei-Wan stood before the repository. They had traveled far into space, far beyond the boundaries of normal galactic routes, following coordinates that the Vethians had left behind 10,000 years ago. The journey had taken only a few days with the Council's fastest ships, but it felt like a lifetime. The two humans had worked nearly every moment of the journey, continuing to refine their translations and prepare for what they might find. The repository itself was a marvel beyond anything anyone could have imagined. It hung in space around a star that most civilizations did not even know existed. The structure was enormous, a great sphere made of materials that did not match anything in the known universe. It was beautiful in a way that made it hard to look at directly, with surfaces that seemed to shift and change color depending on the angle and the quality of light hitting them. A massive structure had materialized from beneath the surface of the archive world after Teo and Hei-Wan had provided the correct linguistic key. The repository was not hidden. Once someone understood the Vathian language, once they had proven their intelligence and patience by decoding it, the path to the repository became clear. The coordinates, written in the meditation chamber and verified through countless documents, pointed directly to this place. As they approached, the repository's surface began to change. Lights appeared along what might have been seams or corridors. A section of the great sphere began to glow, and symbols appeared on the surface. Symbols that both Teo and Hei-Wan could now read without hesitation. The symbols spelled out a greeting in the Vathian language, a simple welcome to those who had come seeking knowledge. The expedition team that had accompanied them on the final journey began to send out probes and sensors to scan the repository. The scientific instruments registered everything from radiation signatures to gravitational fields, but none of the scans revealed what was actually stored within the Great Sphere. The repository itself seemed to be deliberately shielded from external analysis. Teo and Hei-Wan were chosen to be the first to enter. It seemed fitting, given their role in unlocking its secrets. They suited up in environmental protection gear, though there was no clear indication that they would need it. The symbols on the repository's surface suggested that the interior was safe for organic life, but it was impossible to be certain. They walked slowly toward the entrance that had opened in the repository's surface, hand in hand, each drawing strength from the presence of the other. Inside, the repository was vast beyond measure. The chamber they entered was so large that its far walls could not be seen, disappearing into a darkness that even their lights could not fully penetrate. But as they stepped further inside, the chamber began to illuminate itself. Lights appeared throughout the space, and suddenly they could see that the walls were lined with objects. Books, devices, artifacts of every kind, each one representing some aspect of Vathian knowledge. A holographic display activated as they walked deeper into the chamber. It displayed text in the Vathian language, a message that Hei-Wan read aloud. "You have come to the repository of the Vathian peoples," the message said. "Within these walls lies everything that we have learned, everything that we have created, everything that we have discovered about the universe and about consciousness itself. It is yours now. Take it. Use it. Build something beautiful with it." But there was more. The holographic display shifted, showing star maps, thousands of them, each marking a different location in the galaxy. Teo felt his breath catch in his chest as he understood what he was looking at. "These are Vathian worlds," he whispered. "These are worlds where they have seeded consciousness, where they have hidden versions of themselves, waiting to be discovered and awakened by civilizations ready to understand them." The most significant discovery was not the technology or the science stored within the repository, though those were incredible beyond measure. It was the message that the Vathians had left, a message that became clear through the texts and star maps and historical records that filled the chamber. The Vathians had not simply abandoned their civilization and scattered themselves across the universe. They had deliberately chosen to do so. They had learned something fundamental about the nature of growth and consciousness and wisdom, and they had decided that the best way forward was to disperse and allow themselves to be rediscovered, to see how different aspects of their consciousness would develop in isolation, how knowledge would be reinterpreted and reimagined by the civilizations that found them. Over the following weeks, as the Council's scientists and researchers began to catalog and study the contents of the repository, the true impact of what had been accomplished began to sink in. The knowledge contained within was revolutionary. Vathian understanding of physics could reshape the foundations of modern science. Their medical technologies could heal diseases that every civilization in the Council had considered incurable. Their architectural knowledge could teach beings how to build structures that would last not for millennia, but for billions of years. But more than that, the discovery of the repository and the path that had led to it forced every civilization in the Council to reconsider their assumptions about intelligence, about value, about which kinds of minds were best suited to which kinds of problems. The Zelthian ambassador finally approached Teo and Heywan one evening, as they were preparing to return to human space. She moved with a grace that was characteristic of her species, but there was something new in her bearing, something that suggested humility. "You were right," she admitted, and Teo could sense that these words had not come easily to her. 3 months was enough. Not because two humans were somehow intellectually superior to the greatest minds of my civilization, but because you brought something different. You brought adaptability. You brought willingness to fail and try again. You brought an understanding of learning itself that we had forgotten how to use. Heywan smiled at the ambassador. "The Vathians seem to have understood something that we are only beginning to grasp," she said. "Different minds solve problems differently. Speed is not the same as wisdom. Tradition is not the same as truth. And the species that succeed in the long term are the ones that know how to learn, not the ones that know the most." As their ship pulled away from the repository and began the long journey back to Galactic Council space, Teo stood at the viewport and looked back at the great sphere hanging in space. Somewhere within those walls, or perhaps distributed across countless worlds throughout the galaxy, fragments of Vathian consciousness waited, ready to be found, ready to teach the civilizations that came looking for them. The 3-month challenge was over. The real work, the true process of understanding what the Vathians had left behind, was only beginning. And humanity, the youngest member of the Galactic Council, had proven that sometimes the most important discoveries come not from those who know the most, but from those who are willing to learn in new ways, to play with problems like puzzles, and to apply simple tools in extraordinary circumstances.